but just focusing on these are still very subjective. Admittedly, even with these rubrics that they have, this is still very subjective when you're talking about who's evaluating and who's writing up these kinds of things. For those of you unfamiliar, the EOS page here is a news blog run by the American Geophysical Union. And the American Geophysical Union is the largest professional society of, as you might guess, geoscientists in the world, which geoscientists includes everything from hydrologists to climatologists to meteorologists to geologists to oceanographers. Basically, it's anything physical that has anything to do with Earth in here. And so there's that. But what caught my attention, of course, was this particular headline. And yes, it's from mid-June, but it's still worth a read to talk about something in particular. There has been a push in the last few years to get rid of standardized testing, not just in higher ed, but also in K through 12. And, I go back and forth because standardized testing is a mess. But in some cases, I do think the numbers from standardized testing are kind of important. And I want to talk through this article to make that point. After Grexit, reducing bias in in geoscience graduate admissions, dropping the GRE is just a first step toward holistic admissions. To further reduce bias in applicant evaluations, the UMass Amherst Geoscience program has changed the way it assesses students. Now, for those of you who don't know, who aren't very familiar, the GRE refers to the graduate record exam. And it is the specific exam that is usually given for anybody going for a master's or PhD degree. Most schools still administer it, though there certainly has been a push to drop it in the last few years. Most I should say most schools don't administer it, but it is administered by by a company called ETS, which I forget what the acronym stands for, but it has been one of the many things that many graduate programs rely on to do their selection process for admission. And why do I bring this up? Because obviously this has to do with science in the fact that this is how are we selecting who gets to be in a master's and a PhD program and gets selected for that. There's a few other points I can make because I read some of the background material about the GRE and what have you, and why there's an argument that the GRE is pushing implicit biases and all this kind of stuff. And really, it's not that the GRE is. Basically, what I see in the test results is a disparity, but they never prove the reason why. Again, disparity fallacy kind of thing tends to show up. But let's see here. Graduate admissions committees serve as gatekeepers, deciding who has access to higher education and, to a large extent, careers in fields spanning the humanities and science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. These committees have long relied on the graduate record exam, or GRE, results as a supposedly objective measure by which to compare and rank applicants. Recently, though, many graduate programs, including geoscience departments, have staged a Grexit. That is, they dropped the GRE as an application requirement because of its recognized biases and because of pandemic restrictions on the access to the test. So yeah, that's one of the things that happened with the GRE is that you would usually go to a testing center, you would take the test there. You're not allowed a calculator, you're usually allowed pencil and paper and what have you, unless they changed that in recent years. But it's a whole bunch of questions, you're timed on taking it, the whole works here, and it's very similar to the SAT in that you have to get a certain number. It's something like 1 to 1,000 or something like that for each of the thing. It shows you how long it's been since I've taken the GRE. Because I can't quite remember the whole structure of it. Because I did take the GRE. Thankfully, only ever had to take it once. And I'll admit because it's like a lot of you know I deal with climate science and professional off YouTube, and I only took the GRE once, and I actually scored lower on some of the mathematics than I did on the writing side, the writing and reading side of the thing, because usually that's what it is. there's a writing component, there's a reading component, literary component, and a mathematics component here, and you're graded. You get a score for each one and a total score, kind of thing, and that's what's used. And I was told, your your GRE score was a little low, and that's what I was told. And it's just like one of the things that got me through was actually knowing a whole bunch of people, knowing who I wanted to work with in grad school, and those folks knowing me. And so I understand in a lot of ways the hesitancy for using the GRE or continuing to use a standardized test, because it certainly doesn't tell about everything here. And yeah, we're going to get into some of that here. Amid the shift, programs are seeking. Oh, and let me see, because what this is going to show is UMass Amherst's holistic thing here. Because while I do agree that the GRE is flawed, that the GRE is not necessarily the best thing in the world, and should take into account more than just the GRE when deciding graduate admissions, and particularly in geosciences, the problem I have is getting rid of it entirely in favor of some very subjective things. You then miss the whole of whether or not these students have learned the important fundamentals from their undergrad program that they need to be in the graduate program, and that is something the GRE can do, or something alike to the GRE. I won't say the GRE necessarily, but something alike to the GRE can do to account for, have these students learned the basic fundamentals from their undergraduate program that serves them well in the graduate program that they are interested in. And that's what I think is missing from the UMass Amherst holistic thing from their geosciences department. And so we'll get into that. The Geosciences graduate program at the University of Massachusetts Amherst piloted dropping its GRE requirement for graduate applicants in early 2018. In the first few admission cycles after that decision, the admitted graduate students proved well qualified and capable, but the admissions committee was relying on unstructured assessments that are themselves vulnerable to bias. For example, when two candidates appeared to be similarly strong, we might have distinguished them on the basis of the reputations of their undergraduate schools, halo bias. And admittedly, that's a problem, because you go to a really good undergraduate school, sometimes you're presumed to have a really good education from there, and that's not necessarily true. Perceived love of the outdoors. Why does that matter? The affinity. Why does that even matter? Because some things you're not even... Because I can see for like an ecologist and for biologists and botanists and the like, and hydrologists, this will be the case too, and oceanographers and what have you. You're not always going out and about you will be going out and about outdoors, with field work often. But that's not always true for others who are geoscientists who involve more computer intensive studies, but that's a whole other thing. Slight differences in grade point average, ambiguity aversion, or the effectiveness of the recommendation letter writers in championing their mentees, framing bias. Clearly, this approach was still far from ideal, and we found ourselves wondering how best to move on from dropping the GRE. Holistic applicant reviews can reduce bias in graduate admissions by placing greater emphasis on skills and personal attributes. You're going to see what I say. There can be a useful emphasis on that. Where is the fundamental understanding? Inherent qualities of the candidates themselves, then on quantitative metrics such as GPA, which may be influenced by disparities in applicants' work conditions. However, many of the holistic admissions best practices applied in STEM were developed in other science disciplines that differ in critical ways from the geosciences. First, the specific aspects of someone's educational background tend to make them a strong applicant, vary across a broad range of geoscience disciplines. Without consensus on what constitutes a strong applicant, geoscience admissions need a structured evaluation process to avoid falling back on criteria that perpetuate inequities, such as advantaging students from elite undergraduate programs or those with prior research experience. Now, this is a point I want to make real quick, because this is framing students having prior research experience as being a bad thing, when I'll give you a hint. I didn't go to an elite undergraduate program, but I was able to get in and do research. Do you think one compensated for the other? I'm just going to say that because it's just like people think of having some research experience before you go to grad school here. It's framed as though it seems like a bad thing, and I could be misreading that, and I apologize if that's the case. But prior research experience is not a bad thing, and if for me hiring a student, I'd be looking for some of that. If there was any of that in the student's background, that would be a bonus to me. Not an insurmountable thing for somebody who doesn't have research experience. I'm not saying that, but it would be a bonus for me. Second, compared with programs in other science fields, many graduate geoscience programs support a higher proportion of new students with research assistantships as opposed to, say, teaching assistantships or fellowships. This reliance on RAs introduces additional sources of bias by putting admissions decisions largely into the hands of faculty principal investigators who select for specific projects rather than the centralized admissions committee. Okay. I can understand that you want a centralized process where everything works together the way you want. But at the same time, if it is that professor who, by their grant funding, is paying for that student, who will be working with that student the most, who will be training that student more than anyone else, that is the professor who should be having say. And it should have more say than some centralized admissions committee, in my book. I would be annoyed if a centralized committee was telling me I couldn't work with a student that I thought would be really great and was really, really fascinated and interested in something I was working on. So I'd be really, really annoyed. UMass Amherst graduates Geosciences graduate program recently adopted a holistic review process that excludes the GRE, gathers responses to customized supplemental prompts, and relies on multiple rubric assessments to judge the likelihood that applicants will be successful in our program through more equitable evaluations. Oh boy. The limited capacity of faculty to take on new advisees, and the fact that our program does not admit a student without the approval of at least one potential faculty advisor mean, however, that some excellent graduate applicants are not admitted. Our primary goal with our new process, which we will detail below, and which may serve as a useful model for other programs, is thus not to achieve full equity, but to reduce biases in admissions decisions as much as possible. I would like to hear a definition for what the heck you mean by achieve full equity. I really, really want to know that definition here, because yeah, I would love to know what you mean by that. Because if equity means equal outcome, I'm sorry, you're gonna end up screwing a lot of students over. But that's just me. So yeah, this is their thing here. I don't think you can see all of it on the screen that I have, but you can get the sense here. So let me go back. I don't want to read this whole thing, but there were certain things I did want to see. They're talking about engaging in discussion. Okay. Because dropping the GRE did not address the biases in our process, the admissions committee took a first step toward holistic admissions in the winter of 2020 by developing a list of traits that correlate with success in our graduate program. Focusing on applicants' trait rather than experiences can reduce admissions bias and can create a consistent evaluation approach for non-consensus disciplines like the geosciences. We initially compiled a list of traits that graduate schools and employers typically ask referees to address in their assessments of candidates. We then narrowed this list to 6 traits that most closely correlate with student success across all research groups in our program: perseverance, independence, curiosity, ability to work in teams, maturity, and communication skills. Notice that none of that has anything about whether there's fundamental knowledge, whether there's understanding. Can a student do math? Can a student think logically? All those kinds of critical skills that are kind of important for being a scientist, where you are working on a process of getting at the truth. Remember that science is a process by which we get at the truth with regards to something, and it requires a lot of analytics and what have you. And you check for none of that. You check for none of that necessarily. What skills a student has, and whether or not they have fundamental knowledge and reasoning capability. That is important. So here, let me see what. Our one effective strategy for gathering information on trades. In our case, a 4-person committee developed a supplemental form consisting of several open-ended prompts that map desired traits. The committee included one current graduate student whose perspective on how the 6 design traits related to their own success in grad school was critical for crafting supplemental prompts that would be both relatable to applicants and revealing to the admissions committee. You included a graduate student. Okay. We focused on process. I find that unhelpful. Here to have a single graduate student involved, but fine. If you're going to go that way, but also students are students. They don't know everything necessarily about the world, though graduate students are certainly much further along if they're doing a lot of education. We focused on process-based questions rather than outcome-based questions that would advantage applicants with particular achievements. So in other words, we don't like achievement necessarily. That's kind of what it seems like. I mean, what I got from this when I was reading it before was that there's a lack of interest in the fundamental knowledge and reasoning capability that's there. That's what's kind of concerning, that it seems to be lacking in wanting to know about that. Let's see. For example, rather than asking about research experience, which is not available to all undergraduates, that is a true statement. I underscore that, though I would still like to know if a student has that, to be honest. We ask candidates to describe their independence, curiosity, and problem-solving skills. The candidates can draw from any previous experience in answering this prompt, including a research project. We also took care to avoid leading questions. For example, our committee recognized that working successfully in teams does not necessarily mean being a leader. Very true. Asking applicants to describe their past success in a range of team roles is more inclusive of different personalities and encourages applicants to speak to their strengths. Here's the thing that I have with that. I also want a student who's motivated to do work on their own, who can come up with their own idea, and that's actually very valuable to me personally. I think it's a very valuable thing to have in a scientist to begin with, is someone who's very motivated and able to work on their own. That's a whole other thing. Each prompt explains how the traits we aim to evaluate contribute to the success in graduate school. These explanations add transparency to how applications will be considered and reduce disparities among students and variable access to effective mentors. Applicants can see the prompts in advance of applying on our graduate program's webpage, and we suggest that they share the prompts with people writing their letters of recommendation. Well, that would be a given that you would do that. What motivates you to apply to the program requires a multi-year commitment to learning, the decision to... Okay, that's kind of your generic personal statement, kind of almost. Although this might be... These are all things that you're talking about here that could end up in a personal statement, that generic personal statement that everybody who's applying to grad school hates to write. I've talked to more than... I've hated writing it myself, and there's enough graduate students I've talked to and undergraduates who've been like, oh, personal statements are annoying. We've all been there. If you've been through college, you've probably been there and had to write that at one point. Let's see. Tell us about your perseverance and maturity. Completing graduate level coursework, independent study, and research definitely requires perseverance in handling deadlines, challenges, and even failures along the way. Briefly describe a challenging time and describe how you responded to that and what you learned from that experience. They're describing challenging as one where you did not fully succeed in achieving a goal, or completing a task. Then briefly describe an experience where you struggled through a challenging time but eventually succeeded. What helped you get through that struggle and the stress associated with it? As a graduate student, your research will involve working as a team. What roles did you play on the team, and what did you learn about successful teamwork and or team culture? It's all about teams, all about groups. It's not a whole lot of independent thought and construction. I would be curious to know, can you carry out a project yourself from beginning to end? You know? Conducting research as a graduate student requires curiosity in developing a question or hypothesis, and independence, along with creative problem solving and conducting self-directed research. Please describe a time when you took initiative on something, either academic or outside of academics, and that highlights some of these qualities. Standardized rubric, and they put some examples, and they were asked also to include a motivation score. Let's see. Applicant worked 20 hours per week, carrying full course load, double in mathematics. I mean, 1 through 3 here. So 1 is low, 3 is high with this and the like. But this is nothing that I see. And let me think here. So what's not answered to me here is, are these supplemental prompts, because they dropped the GRE altogether, right? Are these supplemental prompts supplements to things like the GRE and the rest of the graduate school application? Because there's a lot of other stuff on the graduate school application that you often have to clear. And is there also still still a personal statement in the graduate school application? This is not clear on all of that. But I'm still not seeing is a whole lot of consideration given to whether or not students actually have basic fundamental knowledge and reason and have demonstrated it. And probably one of the only ways to get at that is with something like a standardized test. Like I said, the GRE is not perfect. I do not think the GRE is perfect at all. But ignoring it altogether, ignoring those achievements that a student has made, yeah. Let's see. More holistic admissions processes depend on a central admissions committee trained in bias vulnerabilities to make equitable admissions decisions. Oh gosh. Somebody want to tell them that the implicit bias research kind of falls apart because implicit bias has no predictive power with regards to behavior, according to psychology and sociology research? Because half of the graduate students, and I did a video on that actually. There's a video back on that early on in this channel that you can go find it. Because half of the graduate students in our program are supported by PI-funded RAs for particular research processes. We need a structure for including faculty advisors in the admissions process. Yeah, I don't want a central admissions committee deciding everything. Consequently, both our admissions committee and potential advisors complete rubrics for each student. The composite scores from each assessor are considered equally. Blah. Advisors have been encouraged to watch a 15-minute video that provides training on how to recognize bias in admissions, assess applicant traits, and use rubrics. Advisors are also provided with effective interview questions, which were compiled by the committee that developed the supplemental prompts. In nearly all cases, the variance among composite rubric scores from different assessors was within 1 point, which speaks to the strength of this approach for guiding admissions. Why does it speak to the strength? Why does it speak to the strength? That doesn't give me a whole lot of. And anyway, our new admissions process means that that advisor can no longer appeal to how well they think an applicant would fit in their specific research group as the sole argument for admission, but rather must demonstrate the applicant's broader potential for success. Employing this process has required widespread buy-in from our faculty to the notion that serves the best interests of their research groups. That it serves the best interests, rather. Having used the rubrics for multiple admission cycles now, several faculty members have remarked process helped them recognize the strengths. For example, supplemental prompts revealed strengths such as the ability to manage 2 jobs simultaneously. Something traditional personal statement focused on students' research interests. That's usually not what the whole thing actually is, but that UMass Amherst may be that way. Another advantage in the process is that all applicants are read carefully, not just those who contact faculty directly. Faculty have reported that although the holistic process takes more effort, it has improved their ability to assess candidates going forward. Okay. Tools and goals. Okay. Enough privacy. Here we go. If enough programs pursue a similar path, we can substantially reduce bias in admissions decisions and foster greater diversity in the next generation of geoscientists. Okay. To wrap this up, because I do want to try and keep this under half an hour. I don't disagree that the GRE is flawed. I actually do think it's pretty flawed here. But I also don't think that judging based on something that could actually be interpreted very subjectively and including almost nothing in this about whether or not a student has the fundamental knowledge and reasoning and did they learn the basics of doing science from their respective programs. um all this is a nice compliment, but getting rid of a standardized test altogether I think is a bad idea. um because for all of its faults, a standardized test can say something very much about whether or not a student has the fundamentals that they need to be in that graduate science program to begin with. And I don't want to forget this here. And the de emphasizing of achievement, often I've found, I mean, well, I can't say often I've found, that's really anecdotal, but de emphasizing achievement here, saying you shouldn't bias toward the students who have achievements. I wonder how that student will that student feel, that student who's done so much to achieve feel really gypped when all those achievements that they have on paper demonstrated, they've won awards, they've done research, all this other kind of stuff, gets ignored because they maybe don't have some of these other skills that you want for somebody who maybe doesn't have as many achievements. I would almost make it think to the student, why did I bother getting these achievements? Why did I bother doing all this, dreaming, working so hard, if I'm just gonna have it all thrown in my face by a graduate committee? But thankfully, there are other schools doing it differently, so this is just UMass Amherst that I'm thinking of right now. But I do wonder that, and for me, I do take a student's achievements as part of when I'm looking at a student's criteria. Um, their achievements are important because through those achievements, they can demonstrate a lot of some of these other soft skills, and they've also demonstrated that they learn things that maybe I don't necessarily have to spend as much time teaching them. And they can also then jump right in and go on and achieve some really great things, more great things. Does that mean another student who hasn't done as much in achievements can't do that? No, I did not say that. I did not say they could not. They might just need a little bit more support to get there, and that's totally fine. I understand that. But I also wouldn't be inclined to ignore a student who's achieved a lot. There's a happy balance in here somewhere, I think. But just focusing on, these are still very subjective. Admittedly, even with these rubrics that they have, this is still very subjective when you're talking about who's evaluating and who's writing up these kinds of things. So that's why I don't think it necessarily works long term either, because it is still subjective. What counts is perseverance, what counts is being independent. Learning MATLAB on your own. Well, that's great. Yeah, that's great. I'm glad you learned that. What I would take into more account would be developing project ideas and maybe executing it all the way through and showing me something. It was like one of the greatest students I could find said, hey, I spotted this problem and I did this to fix it. Is that okay with you? And walk through the analysis of what the student did and have you, and like, good on you. That's an awesome student who's an independent, super independent student, but also comes up with solves problems easily. So all in all, I don't think getting rid of this GRE without replacing it with some other kind of standardized test is a good thing, because it does, for all its faults, help to figure out whether or not a student has learned fundamentals that are important to being a scientist, like mathematics, reasoning, analytic writing. Anyway, That's it for now. Hit the like button on the way out the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz, and let me know what you think in the comments below. Until next time, I'm Adrian, and I hope you all stay curious.